Day 81, Part 1. Good afternoon. Jorge decides to live in a Brazilian soccer stadium. Jorge asks where the soccer stadium is. He lives in Brazil for a long time. Good afternoon. Jorge decides to live in a Brazilian soccer stadium. Jorge asks where the soccer stadium is. He lives in Brazil for a long time. Part 2a. Present. Jorge decides to live in Brazilian soccer stadium. Does Jorge decide to live in a church? No, Jorge doesn't decide to live in a church. He decides to live in a soccer stadium. He decides to live in a stadium. What does Jorge decide? He decides to live in a soccer stadium. Jorge decides to live in a soccer stadium. Does Jorge decide to live in a school? Jorge decides to live in a soccer stadium. Jorge doesn't decide to live in a school. Where does Jorge decide to live? He decides to live in a soccer stadium. Does Jorge decide to work in a stadium? No. Jorge decides to live in a stadium. Part 2b. Pass. Jorge decided to live in a Brazilian soccer stadium. Does Jorge decide to live in a church? Jorge decided to live in a soccer stadium. He didn't decide to live in a church. He decides to live in a stadium. What does Jorge decide? He decides to live in a soccer stadium. Does Jorge decide to live in a school? No, Jorge didn't decide to live in a school. He decides to live in a soccer stadium. Where is Jorge decide to live? In a soccer stadium. Jorge decided to live in a soccer stadium. He decides to live in a soccer stadium. Does Jorge decide to work in a stadium? Jorge decides to live in a stadium. Part 3a. Present. Jorge asks where the soccer stadium is. Does Jorge decide to the drugstore is? Jorge decides to live in a soccer stadium. He asks where the stadium is. What does Jorge ask? He asks soccer stadium. Where the stadium is, here da. Does Jorge asked where Manuel is? Jorge asked in stadium. He asked where the stadium is. Who asked? Jorge. Jorge asked. Jorge asked. Jorge asked where the stadium is. Part 3b. Pass. Jorge asked where the soccer stadium was. Does Jorge ask where the store was? Drugstore was? Jorge asked. He didn't ask where the drugstore was. He was asked where the stadium was. What does Jorge ask? What does Jorge ask? In the stadium was. He asked that. Did Jorge ask where Manuel was? Jorge asked where the soccer stadium was. He didn't ask that. He asked where the stadium was. Who asked? Jorge. Jorge asked that. Jorge asked where the stadium was. Part 4a. Present. Jorge lived in Brazil for a long time. Does Jorge live in Mexico for a long time? Jorge lived in Brazil. Jorge doesn't live in Mexico. How long is Jorge in Brazil for? For a long time. He lives in Brazil for a long time. Does Jorge live in Brazil for 2 years? Does Jorge live in Brazil for a long time? Does Jorge live in Brazil for a short time? Does Jorge live in Brazil for a long time? He doesn't live for short time. He lives for a long time. Where is Jorge live? For a long time. He lives in Brazil for a long time. Part 4b. Past. Jorge lives in Brazil for a long time. Did Jorge live in Mexico for a long time? Jorge lived in Brazil for a long time. He didn't for in Mexico. Jorge didn't live in Mexico for a long time. He lives in Brazil. How long did Brazil for a long? For a long time. He lives in Brazil for a long time. He lives in Brazil for a long time. Does Jorge live in Brazil for 2 years? No, he didn't. He doesn't live in Brazil. He didn't live in Brazil for 2 years. He lives there longer. He lives in Brazil for a long time. Does Jorge live in Brazil for short times? Does Jorge live in Brazil for a long time? He didn't live in Brazil for a short time. He lived for a long time. Where did Jorge live? He lived in Brazil. He lives in Brazil. Part 5. You, Jorge, traveling to Brazil by plane. You think that the culture there is interesting. You watch good soccer in stadium. You want to practice Portuguese. You want to write better and read better and understand better. You're happy to go to Brazil. You can improve your Portuguese. You want to live in Brazil forever. Have a good day. Personal question. What country do you want to live forever? Maybe the United States.